World Economic Forum or the World Elite Forum. Over 300 said elites from around the globe meeting right now in Davos this week for the World Economic Forum. Who's on the list? Well, some of the attendees include U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who's already pleading for more money to fund the war against Russia. NATO Chief Stoltenberg is hinting that he plans on ramping up weapons provisions to Ukraine, saying that this is the way to peace.
Is that if we want that to happen, a peaceful, just end to this war, the way to get there is more weapons to Ukraine. So the more credible we are in our military support, the more likely it is that the diplomats will succeed.
Stoltenberg tweeted yesterday, "Great to start the day in Davos by meeting President Zelensky. Despite a serious battlefield situation, there is cause for optimism. Ukraine retains its independence. Ukrainians have rejected Russia and chosen the West, and Ukraine is closer to NATO than ever before."
Forum founder Klaus Schwab also made some remarks at the meeting. Let's hear some of what he had to say.
Those deeply transformative challenges, which are actually the cornerstone of our program, lead to uncertainty, generalized fear, and pessimism. They force us into a mode of short-term crisis management at the detriment of long-term strategic and sustainable solutions. This reactionary approach undermines our collective faith in the future. And here we losing the faith of our future, we risk to become much more ego-centered and on a national and individual level. To break this cycle, we need a paradigm shift. We must rebuild trust, and that's actually the theme of our meeting. We have to rebuild trust. Trust in our future, trust in our capacity to overcome challenges, and most importantly, trust in each other.
So we covered Zelensky being at the World Economic Forum yesterday. I thought that was something to react to. Stoltenberg saying the path to peace is more weapons for Ukraine because that's the best way for diplomacy to take hold. Obviously, as we've discussed, there was a path to diplomacy very early on in the conflict, and instead we continued to, by some reports, actually scuttled those discussions. The U.S. and the U.K. did, and then continued to send weapons to Ukraine. This whole, like, Ukraine remains free is still Ukraine, that's something to celebrate. Look, of course, I don't want Russia to take over Ukraine, and in fact, Russia's goal is not to subjugate the entire country, but to claim this Russian-speaking territory. And this idea that if we only give them another round of weapons is going to make is going to lead to some diplomatic breakthrough, I think is not plausible, is not something anyone is believing at this point, but is still the top item agenda at this elites forum.
Yeah, in some ways, the speaker gave the game away when they described it as a victory that Ukraine has become closer to the West and to NATO and the IMF over time. Ultimately, that is what this proxy battle is about in the eyes of many who have a more of global economic order worldview of what's been happening here, whether or not Ukraine was going to come further under the influence of Western monetary policy and the kind of, dare I say, a kind of coercive or even neo-colonial way of controlling other countries and keeping them within our orbit through these international monetary organizations, as opposed to adopting a more Eastern-looking Russian focus here. And it seems like the victory in the eyes of these folks is whether or not NATO remains Western aligned, regardless of whether or not that's substantively in the interest of the people of Ukraine, or whether they would have democratically voted for that kind of a trajectory. And so there's something very telling about that speech when they say, well, however many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are dead. They started recruiting old men and women to the army. They're facing the hardest part of the winter right now, with funds having dried up for the United States of America, and they're in no better bargaining position than they were a month after the war. But hey, the elites can still claim a victory, because at the end of the day, their system of economic dominance remains intact.
Yeah, and look, if a substantial portion of Ukraine, like, there's nothing. States themselves are not sacred. If there's a substantial portion of Ukraine and its government that wants to be more Western focused, wants to be more NATO, European Union aligned, and that's what they want, then they should have that. They absolutely have that right. They should have that right to self-determination. And if there's part of the country, again, these are arbitrary lines that got redrawn 100 times, and there's part of the country that wants to be Eastern focused, is Russian speaking, is Russian culturally, and wants to be with Russia. There's nothing, again, sacred about the literal boundaries of the country. That seems like a better outcome for everyone. No one should be forced to share a political space with people they
unless you're one of these major parties, whether you're the United States or whether you're Russia, and your view is that you're losing ground and you're losing members of your coalition by allowing some portion of the world to actually engage in self-determination. I mean, we're seeing these kind of battles all over the world. We see it with the people of Mali finally ousting these remnants of French colonialism. You see it in the taxes that Haiti is still forced to pay in reparations to France of all weird, twisted dynamics. You see that the way that the West maintains control in the world is sometimes often militaristic, but it also is through these mechanisms of financial control. And when those don't work, we see the spillover effects into wars like the ones we have in Ukraine that are so far attenuated in terms of how we've been managing it as outsiders from what the interests of Ukrainians are, that it's honestly is very sad to watch. Because at this point, they have been dragged into the middle of a battle, which is very difficult for them to extricate themselves from without feeling like they've lost so much and gained so little in return. But that is a scenario that they're in precisely because the West, United States and the UK, scuttled negotiations in the month after the conflict emerged. And even before that, because the West courted and dangled the carrot of NATO membership, which was a known provocation for Russia, and did so anyway, because arguably their long-term financial objectives were more important than whether or not a country was literally split apart by war.
And dangling it and then not giving it turned out to be the worst of both worlds, because if they had actually just properly made Ukraine a part of NATO, then, I mean, the deterrent theory is that Russia would not have attacked, or, I mean, that would have caused World War III. But having them in this middle ground where we're saying it could maybe happen, but we're not actually, NATO is not actually obligated to defend Ukraine, allowed Russia to then attack it without provoking the level of reprisals of the U.S. military government, the U.S. military actually intervening rather than just sending aid. So some of the members at the meeting have called for a new world era, I believe. Let's watch some of that.
That order seems to not be the order anymore. We are on the way to a new order, so we are between orders.
Now, I think of this a little bit more about a transition of eras rather than a transition of orders, but the two are kind of cousins of one another. The reason I draw the distinction is because I don't think the international order built after 1945 is getting replaced wholesale with some new order. It will obviously evolve as it has evolved multiple times over the decade since 1945. But I do think in a more sharp and distinctive way, we are moving into a new era, and that's what I talked about in my remarks, that we are, the post-Cold War era has come to a close. We're at the start of something new. We have the capacity to shape what that looks like, and at the heart of it will be many of the core principles and core institutions of the existing order.
Commentator Luke Rudkowski wrote on X, the Davos Bilderberg members want to create a new world order. Where have I heard that before? Obviously, referring to what has been labeled the New World Order conspiracy theory, which is a conspiracy theory, but we do year after year see these elites, the people who run governments, getting together to decide on vast foreign policy and economic matters, and the concern being, does this erode our is this actually democratic? And then at the same time saying democracy is the most important thing. But when you have elites getting together to plan society, is that actually democratic? And is it also a threat to free speech? So we're not talking about this specifically today because I am planning to do a radar on it tomorrow, so viewers can hold me accountable since I'm announcing it ahead of time. I try never to do that. But about specifically the speech implications, there are so many. They did this last year. Brian Stelter moderated a panel on the threat of misinformation. This year, the World Economic Forum ranked misinformation as the #1 global threat, above warfare and climate change and pandemics and everything else. Misinformation. And then they were having a panel on it this year. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. But again, just this. Yes, of course, the spread of false information can be a concerning thing, but when they have it in their head that it's misinformation, or so many people do, to just disagree with them or disagree with what their consensus is. And so many times we've seen whether it's Russiagate or whether it's foreign policy or whether it's COVID-related stuff, later the truth is more complicated than what the narrative held to begin with. And a lot of people who are obsessed with the misinformation topic really want, especially in Europe, want to empower new European speech bureaucrats to be able to police that and look to the U.S. as this kind of outlier because of the First Amendment and say, yeah, you guys have to figure out that First Amendment. It stops you from censoring all this bad speech. That's really a shame. Yeah. Well, people will have to return tomorrow to tune in for that radar, which Robby has absolutely promised to write and cannot renege on. All right. That does it for us for today. Tomorrow on Rising, as I've promised, this radar. So we'll have that and lots more news and some good interviews, and we hope you tune in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who prefer to listen while you're on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. See you later. Bye-bye.